I was recently watching a panel discussion featuring a political theorist who has spent his entire career championing intellectual rigor. He was in the middle of a sharp, almost surgical takedown of the modern voter. He spoke with a quiet, measured intensity about the catastrophic crowd dynamics of social media and the mob behavior that seems to dominate every election cycle. He looked genuinely pained by the lack of reasoning he saw in the public. To him, the average person wasn't just wrong. They were fundamentally unready for the responsibility of deliberation. He argued that until people could resist the noise, they shouldn't be given the microphone. There was a certain cold logic to it that felt hard to argue with in the moment. But as I watched him, I realized the glaring paradox sitting right there on the stage. This man had spent decades in the very environments of free inquiry and open debate that he was now suggesting we should restrict for everyone else. He was using the sharp tools of a free society to argue for a locked door. He was essentially a man who had climbed a ladder to the top of a library, only to insist that the ladder be removed because the people below might trip on the rungs. He was convinced that the unready masses needed to be protected from themselves, seemingly unaware that he was denying them the very training ground that had made him so articulate. What was even more striking was what happened when the moderator pushed him for a solution. As soon as the topic moved from critiquing the failures of the mob to constructing a set of norms or standards for a better democracy, his confidence vanished. He could tell you exactly why the foundation was cracking, but he refused to lay a single brick for a new structure. It's a mindset that's becoming the cultural default. We have become a society that rewards the critic, who stays safe, invulnerable, and infinite in their complaints, while we have lost our appetite for the builders. We are currently caught in a tide of reaction, but we've forgotten that a tide is not a structure. When the water recedes, who will actually be left to build something that lasts? Okay, so that moment, watching someone use the ultimate expression of free thought to argue against giving that freedom to others, it just gets right to the heart of what we're diving into today.
It really does.
This tension between those who critique and those who, construct.
The critic versus the builder.
Exactly. And we're looking at why modern society seems to reward that surgical takedown, that clever critique, over the patient, difficult work of building functional institutions.
And building shared political norms.
Right. And we've got some fascinating material that really explores the intellectual habits that lead to this elitist populist ambivalence, and also the sociological data that shows the real institutional decay that results when everyone becomes a critic, but no one steps up to, lay the foundation.
And what's so fascinating here is that this isn't just a political problem, right? It's a structural one. And it's been examined across political philosophy, sociology, even literary theory.
So it's a deep-seated issue.
It is. This paradox of anti-democratic elitism, which is a major theme we're exploring, gets at exactly this: how modern intellectuals use the very freedoms of inquiry and rational discourse that they then seek to restrict.
Using the tools of democracy to argue against it.
Precisely. They end up diagnosing the general public as, well, unfit for the very deliberation that a functional democracy requires. We're really looking at a foundational instability in modern political thought.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's start our investigation with that philosophical underpinning. We're calling part one, the critic's paradox, or democracy in spite of the demos. That title alone seems to hint at a huge contradiction.
It does. The core conflict we see in a lot of contemporary political thought is what's been termed the elitist populist ambivalence.
Elitist populist ambivalence. Okay, break that down for us.
So on one hand, you have political theorists who rely on democracy as a categorical imperative.
And a categorical imperative is like a foundational, non-negotiable principle.
Exactly. A rule that applies universally, an end in itself.
Yep.
So by this standard, democracy is fundamentally good. Period.
Okay.
But, and here's the ambivalence, simultaneously, these very same theorists disqualify the actual voting population, the demos. The people. They disqualify them based on, the content of their political beliefs or just their perceived incapacity for rational thought.
So it sounds like a philosophical cheat code. They love the idea of democracy, but if the actual participants vote the wrong way,
then the people must be wrong, not the process.
Right.
They advocate for democracy on its own terms, democracy in spite of the demos. The appeal is always to this idealized, formal concept of democracy, plurality, deliberation, rule of law. But the content that democracy is supposed to produce is decided in advance.
And that's what you'd call the content problem.
That's precisely where the content problem emerges, and it's a huge trap for political theory.
So can you give us an example of how this plays out, this attempt to define democracy not just by its rules, but by tying it to specific political content?
Yeah, a great example is how some thinkers approach pluralism. So formal pluralism just means we recognize and are comfortable with the fact that our deeply held beliefs are contestable.
It's a structural rule for how we engage with each other.
It is. But when certain theorists try to suture democracy to, say, a specific left progressive politics, they start arguing that only their content is truly pluralist.
Oh.
They might claim their political agenda is inherently democratic while excluding the opposition, say the right or populist, as being fundamentally anti-pluralist.
But hold on, if the definition of pluralism is purely formal, I mean, just recognizing difference, how can you exclude an entire political movement based on its content without kind of, invalidating your own democratic commitment?
That is the collapse of form and content right there. When they argue, as some theorists like Connolly have, that the agenda of deep pluralism is hampered because the right wing holds so many of those cards, they've stopped describing a universal structure.
And started promoting a partisan outcome.
Exactly. I mean, if pluralism is truly just being comfortable with the contestability of your own creed, then theoretically, a certain kind of liberal humanism and a certain kind of Christian conservatism could both be pluralist in form.
Even if they disagree on basically every policy.
Right. But by equating one side's content with democracy itself, they just collapse that distinction entirely.
And the consequence of that move, as the material highlights, it gets really sharp when you have genuinely problematic positions like xenophobia or climate skepticism that gain real popular support.
That's where the whole thing breaks down. The consequence is that this categorical imperative of democracy forces the intellectual to deny the popularity, the actual cratio or the power of the demos of that regressive position.
Because if they admit it...
If they admit that a large, engaged part of the population wills these things, it just shatters their foundational premise that the demos is inherently rational and good.
So they have to find another explanation.
They're compelled to deny that their political opponent is truly part of the demos at all. They have to find an external cause like misinformation or manipulation, not an internal failure of the system.
This denial of the actual people doing the voting, it brings us to Hannah Arendt. She seems to be one of the most intellectually striking and maybe one of the most problematic examples of this elitist ambivalence.
Absolutely. Arendt's work is this stunning commitment to the ideals of democracy, public space, plurality, debate, while at the same time holding a devastatingly low opinion of the actual masses.
The demos in its traditional sense.
Yeah, the poor, the laboring, the dispossessed. For her, the rise of modern society was nothing short of a profound catastrophe for political life.
And she frames this through this incredibly stark divide she creates between what she calls the political and the social. How does she define the political, her ideal of the polis?
So for Arendt, the political is this sacred realm. It's consecrated by speech, by debate, and crucially, it's totally free from necessity.
Free from necessity, so free from worrying about survival.
Exactly. It's the public sphere where human beings come together as equals to appear to one another. The goal of this space isn't utility or survival, it's meaningful action, lasting achievement. It's the world of the ancient Greek polis, where the only reason political actors were free is because they had slaves or property taking care of necessity for them.
And the social, then, is everything else. It's the stuff of daily life, keeping the body alive.
That's right. The social is defined by the maintenance of bodily needs and the rise of the masses, who she calls the animal laborans. The laboring animal.
The laboring animal. That's a harsh term.
It is. And her core concern is that in the modern world, this strict dichotomy between the political and the private necessary realm has just collapsed. The social, this concern with economic management, with collective housekeeping, with survival, has invaded and completely swallowed the political space.
So this is a pretty harsh condemnation of modernity. I mean, if our politics today are mostly debates about healthcare or the cost of living or economic policy, she would see that as the abolition of politics itself.
She would, absolutely. She views the rise of the social as leading directly to disasters, including totalitarianism, because the public realm stops being a space for free, meaningful action.
And instead it becomes
a vast consumption-driven management system. When the animal laborans occupies the public sphere, it brings the mindset of necessity with it. The human being, as she puts it, sees everything from the viewpoint of the stomach, even if they're personally wealthy.
Wait a second, because if modern society finally fulfills that historical dream of liberation from sheer labor, Shouldn't people be more free to engage in the political? But Arendt argues that even when we're liberated from physical necessity, the masses keep with the laborer's mindset.
That is the ultimate paradox of her critique. We end up in what she calls a society of laborers without labor.
Huh.
Even when necessity is lifted, the masses still approach the political in terms of the social, in terms of maintenance, utility, and consumption. Think of modern political debate. The focus is constantly on maximizing convenience, maximizing income, or minimizing inconvenience. For her, this is a fundamental failure to achieve true political freedom.
But that sounds incredibly elitist. I mean, isn't she basically saying that anyone who is concerned with feeding their family or paying their rent, which is, the vast majority of the public, is fundamentally incapable of true political experience?
It is the starkest expression of elitism you can find.
It seems like she's saying you have to be financially independent to be politically relevant.
That's the logical conclusion. By making liberation from necessity a categorical precondition for political participation, she sets up an ideal that just inherently excludes huge parts of the population based on their socioeconomic condition or their intellectual habits. Her political ideals are pristine, but they are catastrophically unstable in the face of modern mass society and its economic realities. She effectively locks the doors of the Pelosi against anyone who has to engage with the material world to survive.
Okay, so if the theorist is critiquing the democratic structure from this position of privilege, or at least intellectual freedom, and those critiques consistently disqualify the actual voting population, we have to look at the tool they're using. If critique is so celebrated, what happens when it becomes an end in itself? A kind of perpetual intellectual process that never actually transitions into construction.
And this is where we shift from the critique of the demos to the critique of the critic. We turn to the theoretical preference for what's called deconstructive critique. In its philosophical origins, it's far more subtle than just simple analysis or, demolition.
Yeah, a lot of people associate deconstruction with just tearing things down or saying everything is relative. Is that an unfair simplification?
It's a massive simplification, especially if you go back to its original context. Deconstruction isn't a simple critique. It's more like a continuous displacement of a structure. The philosopher is operating from within the tradition, using its own tools and hidden resources.
Exploiting its contradictions.
Exactly. Exploiting its structural contradictions to reveal that the system is never truly complete. It's like using the very ladder of metaphysics to climb up and then turning around to analyze the hidden nature of the ladder itself.
So the goal isn't demolition, but revealing the hidden architecture.
Precisely. It's trying to locate what's called the untranslatable remainder, the element that makes the structure's logical completion impossible.
The glitch in the matrix.
Kind of. Think of the analogy of the Tower of Babel. Deconstruction is like observing an unfinished edifice whose half-completed structures are visible, letting one guess at the scaffolding behind them. It reveals that what looks like a solid, finished facade is actually resting on contingency and ongoing, unstable processes.
That's a really powerful image. It suggests that philosophy or institutional theory often presents itself as this grounded, finished building, but that foundation is just a veil for an underlying uncertainty.
And that structural insecurity is masked through architectural metaphors. The philosophical tradition is obsessed with grounds, foundations, superstructures.
Right.
Yet it often dismisses space or architecture as merely metaphorical. The material we're looking at points out that metaphysics produces this image of the secure, familiar house precisely to veil its own lack of external support or ground. The limits of philosophy are paradoxically established by this metaphorical denial.
So the metaphor of the house is central to how we establish authority and exclusion. It creates an inside and an outside.
Absolutely. Institutions, when you look at them through this critical light, are interior spaces of domination. They operate under what is called the law of the house.
The law of the house.
And the house is made possible by the very violence it conceals. And this isn't just violence that happens inside the house, it's the domestic violence that is the violence of the interior space itself, which is enacted and concealed at the same time to produce the effect of a defined, secure space.
Can you ground that for us? When we talk about institutional violence being concealed by the structure itself, what does that actually look like in the modern world?
Well, think about bureaucratic systems. A large institution, say a government agency or a major corporation, it creates rules and jargon and protocols that seem neutral and totally necessary. The house of the institution provides security and order.
Right. It seems rational.
But the system is built on a prior violence of exclusion, who is allowed in, whose language is deemed acceptable, whose needs are ignored from the start. So when a victim of bureaucratic error, for example, tries to get a problem fixed, they often just confront the system itself, a wall of concealed contradictions and complex rules that serve to protect the institution, not the person.
So the rule set is the violence of the interior.
It is. It makes it impossible to appeal to some outside standard because the system itself defines the only available standards.
This really raises the stakes for the pure critic then. If they can only critique the structure by inhabiting it, and that structure conceals this fundamental violence, how do they avoid just becoming a neutralizing force instead of an agent of change?
And that is the crucial impasse. It's the risk that deconstruction, when it's reduced to a technical method, which is what happened in certain academic literary circles, risks becoming purely neutralizing and skeptical. The skeptical critic sees the inherent undecidability of concepts as just the opposite of decidability. It gives them a kind of negative assurance.
A certainty in uncertainty.
Yes. And this position is, as the source material says, highly productive of critical discourse. It generates a ceaseless, dissatisfied movement that produces endless books and papers analyzing the flaws in the system.
But ultimately leaves everything as it is.
Exactly. It's like a job security program for the critic. They expose the flaws, publish the exposure, and then abandon the site, allowing the edifice to just keep standing.
And the political critic, coming from a different angle, sees this exposure of structural undecidability as a dead end for action. They argue that this kind of critique just bolsters the social status quo by proving that nothing can ever truly be fixed or grounded.
Exactly. They worry that until radical critique moves beyond simple neutralization, beyond the mere discovery that the foundation is contingent, it can't truly intervene in the field of oppositions it criticizes.
So it's not enough to just point out the problem.
The original philosophical project insisted that deconstruction is not separable from the politico-institutional problem. It demands a new investigation of responsibility. But if the critic stops at the analytical stage, the end result is often exactly what its skeptics feared: a self-serving practice that's highly productive of critical discourse, but ultimately leaves everything, the concealed violence, the crumbling foundation, completely intact.
And the theorist remains safe in their critical enclosure, never having to risk the failure of actually trying to build something. Okay, so if the structural violence of the house is concealed and pure critique often leaves that violence intact, and we constantly see evidence that the masses are prone to irrationality and delusion, we have to diagnose the problem correctly before we can build a solution. Is it true, as the elitists argue, that the average person is just incompetent, or is something else producing this pervasive ignorance?
This diagnosis is the critical turning point in our whole deep dive. We basically have two competing principles to explain popular irrationality, whether it's, voting against one's own economic interest or believing misinformation.
Let's start with the traditional and maybe more intuitive view, the incompetence principle.
The incompetence principle, and this has a lineage that stretches all the way from Plato to contemporary thinkers like Jason Brennan, argues that the prevailing ignorance we see reveals an essential characteristic of the demo's nature.
So it's an inherent flaw.
An inherent, unmediated psychological flaw. People are simply too uneducated, too busy, or too emotionally driven to govern themselves effectively. Their political opinions aren't produced by the system. They are autonomous expressions of a flawed self.
And the solutions that come from this principle, they tend to involve restricting democratic power, right?
Precisely. This is what leads to calls for epistocracy, which is rule by the knowledgeable. They argue we should require a competency test to vote, or maybe give greater voting weight to people with higher education or certified expertise.
So they infer from the public's lack of policy knowledge a state of permanent incompetence.
Yes, and conclude that the uninitiated just can't be relied upon to make consequential collective decisions.
But isn't demanding a competency test just a more sophisticated way of locking that library ladder behind the highly educated? It presumes that expertise in one area, say economics, equates to moral or social competence. It just reproduces the very class division that aren't used to disqualify the masses in the first place.
That's the structural failure of the incompetence principle. It isolates the fault within the individual, and it completely ignores the social conditions that produce the ignorance. It looks at the effect, the stupid opinion, and concludes the cause is the stupid person. It's a very easy, but ultimately insufficient diagnosis.
So what's the alternative diagnosis coming from that critical tradition of the Frankfurt School?
That is the theory of socially necessary delusion. developed by thinkers like Adorno and Marcuse. This theory argues that ignorance and irrationality are contingent, not essential.
Meaning they depend on circumstances.
Exactly. They are a necessary reflection of antagonistic objective social conditions that demand adaptation. The fundamental problem is the contradictory system, not the person trying to survive within it.
So the inability to reason correctly about politics isn't a character flaw, but it's a survival mechanism within a faulty reality.
Correct. As Adorno starkly put it, if there really is no correct life in the false life, then actually there can be no correct consciousness in it either. Ignorance isn't something that can be overcome by just handing someone a textbook. It's a necessary distortion caused by the social totality. This approach reframes ignorance not as some ahistorical psychological flaw, but as a pathology with a definable social function.
Okay, let's use climate denial as a model here, because it perfectly illustrates this widespread, politically consequential irrationality. If you ask an average person, they would say they want a habitable planet for their children. Yet a large political movement actively resists acknowledging the scientific reality of climate change.
Right, and if you view this from one perspective, the perspective of human needs, ecological sustainability, or what we can call use-value climate denial, is erroneous to the point of absurdity. It's suicidal for the species.
It makes no sense.
It makes no sense. However, when you view it from the dominant perspective of our society, which is maximizing ever-increasing profit and unlimited capital growth, what we call exchange value climate denial, is suddenly perfectly rational.
How can the same delusion be both suicidal and perfectly rational at the same time?
Because the current economic system, the social totality, is predicated on unlimited growth, rapid extraction, and the continuous maximization of exchange value. It literally cannot reconcile itself with the hard, objective limit of ecological sustainability and climate science.
So if the system were to truly accept the science,
it would have to fundamentally alter its core logic of infinite expansion, which would lead to a catastrophic economic contraction, at least in the short term.
So to keep the whole thing going.
To sustain the prevailing order, that contradiction, the fact that our current course will soon render the planet uninhabitable, must be neutralized, smoothed over, or simply denied. Climate skepticism is not a random mistake. It is a delusion necessary for the reproduction of the social totality in its current form.
Wow. So the people who hold these seemingly absurd beliefs aren't fundamentally stupid. They are, in a way, unconsciously enacting the required adaptive behavior for the system to maintain its own logic. Their ignorance protects them from confronting a system that they feel powerless to change.
Precisely.
Yeah.
They know, but they don't know. They can't afford to truly know because acknowledging the truth would demand action, a radical confrontation with the economic structure that they feel powerless to achieve and that the media and political system actively discourage.
And this framework, socially necessary delusion, it circumvents that elitist trap beautifully. If you're the Democrat who believes in the categorical imperative, you have to treat the ignorant opinion as valid, and by doing that, you bypass the critique of the bad reality that produced it.
Right.
But if you're the elitist who believes in the incompetence principle, you use that ignorance as justification for restricting democratic power, again, avoiding the critique of the system that made the people ignorant in the first place.
It forces us to ask, what is the social function of this pathology? Why must people think this way to survive this system? And we can see this illustrated so perfectly in that famous scene from the novel The Remains of the Day.
The butler, Stevens. Let's slow down and examine that exchange. It's a great example.
It's perfect. So in that scene, you have two aristocrats discussing politics. And one of them, the elitist, suggests that the butler, Stevens, is too uneducated, too focused on his domestic duties to have a valid political opinion.
Okay.
Then the other gentleman, the skeptical one, adopts the position of the Democrat, and he insists that the ordinary man in the street is perfectly entitled to give opinions on politics.
So you've got the elitist condemning the masses and the Democrat affirming their inherent right, even if their opinions are totally ill-informed.
Yes. But the material highlights that both of them are fundamentally wrong, and they both miss the actual point. The Democrat insists that, despite being a lifelong domestic servant, Stevens has autonomous, valid opinions. And by doing that, he completely obscures any possible relationship between Stevens' political opinion and the social necessities of a world divided between masters and servants.
And the elitist.
the elitist, for his part, takes Stevens' lack of competence as a justification for the continued existence of that hierarchical world.
And what the theory of socially necessary delusion reveals is that both of them miss the critique of the bad reality of domestic servitude, of blind obedience, and the inferiority complex that necessarily shapes Stevens' inability to answer political questions. His ignorance isn't a flaw in him, it's a product of the antagonistic objective social conditions of his life.
So the critical project, therefore, is not simply to wait for a democracy to come, some idealized future state where all problems are magically solved. We must wait for demos to come.
A demos to come.
A citizenry that is trained, situated, and enabled in a structural reality that doesn't actively demand delusion for its own survival. And that shifts the focus entirely from criticizing the voter to building a better world for the voter to inhabit.
Okay, so if the problem is structural, a faulty system producing necessary delusion, and pure deconstruction just kind of circles the problem by neutralizing the social status quo, what does the constructive work of building actually look like? How do we move from the safety of the critique to the risk of construction?
Construction means actively restoring the social and communicative prerequisites for a functional deliberation. And for that, we need a framework for defining what good deliberation even looks like. A critical framework for this comes from Jürgen Habermas with his concept of the ideal speech situation.
The ideal speech situation. Okay. What are the conditions that Habermas lays out for us to actually have a conversation that leads to legitimate outcomes instead of just posturing?
So, the ideal speech situation describes a communicative practice that is free from distortion, coercion, and ideology. In this ideal realm, the only legitimate power is the force of the better argument.
That's just the best idea wins.
The best idea wins, and the conditions are pretty expansive. Everyone capable of speech is entitled to participate, to question assertions, to introduce new topics, and to express their attitudes, needs, and desires without any fear of reprisal.
Essentially, everyone gets a seat at the table, and the best idea wins, regardless of who proposes it. But if we're constantly dealing with these social structures that conceal power and violence, how can any real-world situation truly achieve this freedom from coercion? I mean, strategic actors will always find ways to manipulate the process.
The challenge in practice is constant, which is why monitoring misuse and publicly analyzing manipulation are essential parts of the constructive project. And we have this compelling case study that tried to put this into practice. The Colruyt Company, a major Belgian retail chain, in the development of their internal information system, ICID.
Tell us about ICID. How did a retail chain try to implement an ideal speech situation?
Well, Colruyt was founded with these really strong ethical principles, influenced by both Catholic belief and some early Marxist social experience. They placed a huge emphasis on open communication and self-managed teams.
So they wanted staff input on everything.
On daily tasks, even on strategic decisions. And the ICID system was developed as this comprehensive early groupware system, a network that fostered open, documented, and efficient communication across all levels of the company. ICID allowed anyone in the company to raise a problem. A self-managed team could then be formed, often by people just self-selecting, to discuss and communicate possible courses of action. The system ensured that all staff who would be affected by a decision were notified and had documented opportunities for comment, reflection, and argumentation.
That sounds incredibly open, but how did they ensure the outcome was genuinely the result of communicative action, the force of the better argument, and not strategic action, which is all about achieving a predefined goal?
That tension was inherent. While the process relied on argumentative consensus, they recognized that eventually a nominated person had to make the final decision for accountability. But the system's transparency was its defense mechanism. And in one famous instance, a manager succeeded in subverting the whole process through strategic manipulation.
What exactly did they do?
So this manager was leading a project that required broad consensus. He knew that one key, highly influential member of the team disagreed with his preferred outcome.
Okay.
So the manager strategically timed the completion and signing off of the final decision process during a 2-week period when that key member of staff was known to be on holiday.
No way.
By pushing the decision through in their absence, the manager achieved his goal quickly, and he transformed what should have been a consensual communicative process into a strategic maneuver oriented purely toward timely efficacy.
So the system was technically followed, the deadline was met, the boxes were checked, but the whole spirit of the ideal speech situation was just completely violated.
Precisely. The goal was to win, not to find the best argument. But the beauty of the ICID system was that the misuse was inherently documented. The system stored the timeline, the comments, the decision, the absent member's vacation notice.
The paper trail.
The paper trail led to a very public, company-wide discussion about the ethics of that manager's timing. And the organization established a new public norm. That kind of strategic timing, even if it was technically permitted by the system's mechanics, was unacceptable because it violated the fundamental communicative commitment of the company.
So the lesson there isn't that manipulation is impossible. It's that systems designed for construction have to include mechanisms for monitoring and publicly analyzing misuse. The purity of the system isn't guaranteed. It has to be continuously enforced through scrutiny.
That monitoring is the constructive act. However, applying this to a whole democracy is far harder, because when we look at the structural decay of democracy today, the objective norms and social capital you need to even start a deliberation free from coercion are eroding so rapidly. We have to look at the empirical data demonstrating the collapse of the glue required for a constructive political life.
So what is that data telling us about social capital?
The decline is substantial, and it's pervasive. Since the early 1970s, the percentage of people who say they can generally trust others, not political figures, just their fellow man, has declined markedly.
How much?
It's dropped from nearly 50% down to less than a third today. This is a massive structural loss of baseline social trust.
Wow, and if I can't trust the person next to me, then I certainly can't trust the political system they support. That decline in trust must directly fuel the elitists' argument about the incapacity of the demos.
It does, and is paralleled by a sharp decline in democratic confidence. In 1974, only about 15% of Americans reported distrusting the public's judgment.
And today?
Today, that number is staggering. 4 out of every 10 people report that they have lost confidence in the people's ability to make democratic choices. We are losing faith in the collective capacity of our fellow citizens.
And this breakdown isn't just political. It's happening at the community level. It's eroding the organic ties that create shared experience.
That's the key structural decay. Participation rates have declined substantially across so many organizations. For instance, the number of people who reported talking with their neighbor a few times a month or more dropped significantly in recent years. Religious attendance is also down, with the share of the public who never attend religious services climbing from 10% in 1972 to almost 30% today.
So the shared physical spaces and norms of reciprocity, the basic ingredients of social capital, are fraying rapidly, leaving us tribalized and atomized.
That's the landscape we're working in.
So if the problem is that we don't trust each other because we don't know each other, and we can't debate productively because we are entrenched in these socially necessary delusions, then the constructive solutions must focus on rebuilding this social capital. What are the most promising building-oriented solutions out there?
Well, one of the most consistently effective tools identified in sociological research is simply fostering greater exposure and structured contact between different groups. This is the contact hypothesis, and it shows that when people from a defined in-group spend time with those from an out-group, especially working toward a common goal, prejudice declines significantly.
So the antidote to tribalism is enforced proximity and shared purpose.
Exactly. And we see this borne out in studies on military service, where the average American soldier often has significantly more closer interracial friendships than the average American civilian of the same age and social class.
Because of that shared experience.
The shared, inescapable experience of service, of facing adversity together, it just breaks down the necessary conditions for tribalism and delusion.
This suggests a strong structural intervention is required, not just a set of passive critiques.
Which leads to a highly promising structural idea to institutionalize this contact. Universal national service.
Mandatory service.
Asking every young American to give a mandatory year of military or civilian service, not just as an option, but as a universal expectation, would fundamentally limit tribalism and social division. It builds bridges instead of walls by forcing young people from every socioeconomic, regional, and ethnic background to work side by side, sharing an experience that transcends existing divisions and rebuilds a shared sense of citizenship.
That structural intervention tackles the problem of social division directly. Are there smaller, community-level examples that show how building new norms locally can generate that macro-level trust?
Yes. You can look at the city of Santa Monica, California, which experimented with microgrants. They empowered residents to apply for small sums of money to implement hyper-localized projects aimed at improving well-being in their specific neighborhoods.
So this wasn't abstract policy. It was concrete, shared action. A community garden, a street fair, a shared project to clean up a block. Really tangible things.
And what was the outcome of this localized building?
The overall record on citywide well-being was mixed, as these things take a long time. But in a short period, they saw an impressive jump in the proportion of residents who reported that their neighbors could be trusted and counted on in times of need.
So the simple act of laying a few bricks together in a shared neighborhood space, even metaphorically, generates the macro-level effect of trust and reciprocity.
It confirms that social capital is not some ethereal concept for academics.
Yeah.
It's the functional, reproducible networks and norms that determine the quality of our collective life. We need to stop rewarding the person who just points out the crack in the wall and start funding the person who puts the mortar and brick in place.
And this is where the critic of the critic is often necessary. Because those who champion the benefits of social capital often mistakenly distrust the government. But structural programs like universal national service or city-backed microgrants are often exactly what is needed to generate the necessary glue that the market and our atomized society have failed to provide.
What we've seen today, then, is that the catastrophic crowd dynamics that worry the critics, the ignorance, the irrationality, the tribalism, these are not an eternal, inevitable flaw of human nature.
Not at all.
They are a product of a structural reality, a reality where the foundation of social trust and objective standards has been ignored and allowed to decay.
And critiques of the existing structure, the deconstruction that reveals the hidden violence and concealed contradictions, those are absolutely necessary. They're the indispensable first phase of analysis.
But only the first phase.
Right. Without moving into the second phase, the constructive project of building new norms, applying new principles, or laying new bricks for a better structure, the critique risks becoming exactly the sort of neutralizing, self-serving exercise that allows the existing power structure to remain safe and unchallenged.
So the easy posture is that of the critic, who stays safe and invulnerable, never risking failure by attempting to build something. The real responsibility lies with the builder, who risks being wrong, who risks having their structure torn down, but actually constructs something that lasts beyond the current tide of reaction, something that gives people a reality where they can afford to be rational.
And we must move past the elitist populist ambivalence by recognizing that we should not be waiting for a democracy to come, some idealized system that will solve all our problems. Our true task is the harder, more immediate construction of a demos to come, a citizenry that is trained, connected, and situated in a social reality that does not demand delusion for its own survival.